I don't usually post on Reddit, but I've been lurking for years. I've read so many of those posts where someone gets dismissed, mocked, or underestimated by family, only to turn it all around years later. I used to read them in my tiny, suffocating apartment while eating cheap noodles and wonder if I'd ever get to tell a story like that. I never thought I would. Honestly, I was too busy surviving. But here I am, 28 years old, sitting in a house that I own outright. A house that's quiet enough for me to hear my own thoughts, decorated the way I want, with furniture I didn't have to assemble out of desperation, but because I liked the design. It still feels surreal. I'll start from the beginning, though, because context matters. I grew up in a pretty average middle-class family. Dad worked in logistics, Mom was a nurse, and my uncle, my dad's older brother, was the entrepreneur of the family, which meant he had a string of failed businesses but still spoke with the confidence of a man who thought he'd figured out life. If you've ever met someone who treats family gatherings like a TED Talk about the hustle, you'll know the type. I was the quiet kid, the one who drew in the corner, obsessed over fonts and Word, spent more time rearranging the colors of my school notes than actually listening to the lecture. Naturally, I fell in love with design. After college, I landed a stable job at a mid-sized agency. Good pay, good benefits, an office chair that didn't squeak. My parents breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, some stability, my mom said, like my existence had been a long gamble that was only now breaking even. But I hated it. Not the work itself, though designing endless corporate brochures about things like water filtration systems wasn't exactly inspiring, but the environment, the endless meetings, the feeling that I was spending all my creativity on work I didn't care about. Every Sunday night felt like a countdown to execution. So, at 23, I quit. I told my parents first. I remember the silence on the phone after I said, I think I'm going to go freelance. It was like I'd told them I'd decided to audition for a circus. Dad's voice went flat. Why would you throw away a good job like that? Mom tried for a softer approach, but the disappointment leaked through every word. Honey, freelancing isn't stable. Don't you want to think about your future? About a family someday? And my uncle, when he found out, he laughed, literally laughed, slapped me on the back at a barbecue and said, What are you going to design, huh? Logos for lemonade stands? Bro, freelancing is code for unemployed. I smiled through it, but inside, I felt the sting. The truth was, I didn't have much of a plan. Just a handful of small gigs I'd picked up on freelance platforms, a little savings, and a lot of restless determination. I told myself I'd make it work because I couldn't imagine going back to that cubicle cage. The first year was brutal. I worked at a tiny desk crammed into the corner of my one-bedroom apartment, surviving on instant noodles and cheap coffee. My internet bill felt like a luxury expense. There were days I didn't get a single job offer. Nights I stared at the ceiling, wondering if my parents were right. Maybe I was a fool. Family didn't help. Every holiday, I braced myself. Dad would ask, So, found any real clients yet? Mom would say, You can always go back to your old job. Maybe they'll take you back if you ask nicely. And my uncle, God, my uncle, he'd lean back in his chair, smirk, and say things like, Design is fun as a hobby. But for paying bills? Not so much. I learned to stay quiet, nod, and change the subject. The less I said, the less ammunition they had. Friends drifted away, too. Most were moving up the ladder at their jobs, posting promotions on LinkedIn, traveling on company money. I was the guy scraping together $300 projects from clients in random time zones, answering emails at 3 a.m. It was lonely. I won't sugarcoat it. But slowly, so slowly, things started to shift. I improved my portfolio. I built relationships. One small client recommended me to another, then another. My rates went from laughable to livable. I learned how to sell myself, how to negotiate, how to say no to bad deals. And then, the big one. A tech startup in Europe found my work on Dribbble and reached out. At first, I thought it was spam. But it wasn't. They needed a full rebrand and were willing to pay more than I'd made in 3 months at the agency. That job changed everything. I poured myself into it. No sleep, no weekends, just design. When the launch hit, it was a success, and suddenly, my inbox wasn't empty anymore. Within 2 years, I was making more than I ever did at my stable job. Within 3, I had clients on 3 continents. Within 4, I bought my house. You'd think that would change how my family treated me. And it did. Just not in the way I expected. The shift was so sudden, it felt almost comical. Dad started introducing me to his friends as my son, the designer. He works with international clients, you know. Mom bragged about me at church, saying I was always so creative. We always knew he'd make something of it. And my uncle. Oh, my uncle. He started sending me screenshots of his friend's company logo and asking, "Hey, think you could give them some advice?" I told them my nephew is a big shot now. It was like they had all collectively developed amnesia, like the years of mocking and dismissal had been erased, rewritten into some rosy narrative where they were my biggest cheerleaders all along. And here's where I'll admit, for a while, I went along with it. I smiled. I let them play pretend. It was easier than fighting, easier than dredging up old wounds. But inside, the bitterness grew, because I remembered. I remembered every sarcastic remark, every time they treated me like the family disappointment, every holiday where I sat there feeling like a failure while they laughed at my expense. And now that I had made it, suddenly I was valuable. Suddenly, I was proof of their support. I kept quiet, but something in me hardened. Because one day, I knew I'd have to set the record straight. Success has this strange way of rewriting people's memories. At least, that's how it felt with my family. When I first started making real money, I didn't announce it. I didn't even tell my parents when I bought my house. They only found out because Mom saw a glimpse of it during a video call, and her eyes went wide. "That's not your apartment, is it?" I admitted it wasn't. Said I bought a place. Paid off. No mortgage. There was silence on the line, the kind where you can hear the gears turning. Then came the flood of questions. How? When? Where? My dad's tone wasn't disbelief exactly. More like cautious curiosity, as if he were trying to fit this new fact into the version of me he'd carried for years. From then on, everything changed. At family gatherings, Dad started slipping little comments into conversations. "You know, design is a big industry now. My son's got clients overseas. Very high-level work." Mom chimed in too, telling relatives about my entrepreneurial spirit, as if that was something she'd been applauding all along. And my uncle went full revisionist historian. Suddenly he was saying things like, "I always told him, stick with it and you'll get somewhere." Didn't I say that, huh? I'd sit there, biting my tongue so hard it hurt, because no, he hadn't said that. He'd said freelancing was code for unemployed. He'd laughed in my face. But correcting him would have meant opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through yet. So I let them play their parts. At first, their fake support was almost tolerable. Annoying, but tolerable. But then came the asks. The first was small. Mom called one afternoon and mentioned, very casually, that my cousin needed a new laptop for school. She sighed about how expensive things were these days, then said, "Of course, with how well you're doing. Maybe you could help out. You know, as family." I didn't answer right away. She filled the silence with, "It wouldn't have to be a new one. Even a refurbished one would help." I ended the call politely, but inside I was seething. Not because she asked. I get that families help each other out sometimes, but because of the tone. Like my success automatically came with an obligation. Like all those years of being the family disappointment had been erased, replaced with the role of provider. Then Dad asked me if I wanted to invest in one of my uncle's new business ideas. Something about importing fitness equipment from China. "It'd be good for the family," he said. "And your uncle's got the experience." I almost laughed. Experience? The man had burned through 3 businesses in 10 years, leaving nothing but unpaid debts and half-baked websites behind. But now I was expected to bankroll his next failure. I said no, as politely as I could. Dad sounded disappointed. My uncle didn't say anything directly, but later I overheard him telling someone at a barbecue. "Yeah, he's got the money, but he's tight with it. Doesn't get that family comes first." That one stung, because family hadn't come first when I was struggling. They hadn't been there when I couldn't afford groceries, when I was skipping meals to keep the lights on. Back then, family came second to their mockery, their lectures, their smug reminders that I'd thrown away stability. Now suddenly family came first, because I was useful. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I remember one particular Sunday dinner. We were all gathered around the table, the smell of roast chicken filling the room. My uncle was holding court, as usual, talking about his latest venture. My parents nodded along, smiling, while I quietly picked at my plate. Then he turned to me. "Hey, maybe you could design the branding for it." Family discount, of course. I set my fork down. I don't do discounts. The table went quiet for a moment. My uncle forced a laugh. Come on, don't be like that. We're family. I don't do discounts, I repeated. Calm, flat, no explanation. Mom jumped in quickly, trying to smooth things over. He's just joking, honey. Don't take it the wrong way. But I wasn't taking it the wrong way. I was taking it exactly the way he meant it. A demand, disguised as a joke, based on the assumption that my work, and by extension, my time, my energy, my years of struggle, wasn't worth full value to them. That night, lying in bed, I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace. All the times I'd let their dismissive comments slide. All the times I'd pretended their sudden support didn't make me want to scream. Something in me shifted. I realized I didn't just want to succeed quietly anymore. I wanted them to see, not just the end result, but the road I'd walked to get here. Every lonely night, every anxious morning, every cruel comment from the people who were supposed to believe in me. But I didn't want a screaming match. I didn't want to explode at a family dinner and look like the bitter one. That would give them another story to twist. He's so sensitive, can't even take a joke. No, if I was going to set the record straight, I'd do it on my terms. Calm, controlled, unmistakable. That's when the idea of the masterclass came to me. It started as a joke in my own head. What if I invited them all to a presentation? What if I laid out, step by step, exactly what it took to get where I am? Not the glossy version they tell people now, but the raw reality. What if I put their words, their dismissals, right alongside the milestones they ignored? The more I thought about it, the less like a joke it felt. I could do it. I had the skills to design something powerful, something that would hit harder than any angry rant. I could turn my pain into a presentation, a literal masterclass in perseverance, with a subtext sharp enough to cut. And when it was done, when they'd sat through every uncomfortable minute of it, I wouldn't need to yell or argue. I'd just stand there, calm and collected, and let the silence do the work. That thought carried me for weeks. Every time my uncle made a sly comment, every time my parents tried to rewrite history, I held on to it. The quiet, devastating satisfaction of knowing what was coming. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that true revenge doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes, it just has to be undeniable. Once the masterclass idea lodged itself in my brain, it wouldn't let go. It was like a pebble in my shoe, irritating at first, but eventually shaping the way I walked. I started sketching out slides in my head while brushing my teeth, while waiting in line at the grocery store, even during client calls. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even the couple of friends I still keep in touch with. This was mine, my plan. But before I could put it together, I knew I had to revisit the years that had shaped me, the ones I'd tried so hard to forget. Because the whole point wasn't just to brag about where I'd landed. It was to show the path, the ugly, lonely, exhausting path they'd dismissed every step of the way. So I dug through old folders, notebooks, emails. I found screenshots of my first pathetic freelance gigs. Logos I'd made for $20 that made me cringe now. Email exchanges where clients ghosted me, leaving me panicked over rent. Notes I'd scribbled to myself. 3 more months. Just hold on 3 more months. And the memories came flooding back. Like the winter where I couldn't afford heating. I'd sit at my desk wearing 2 sweaters, a blanket wrapped around me, hands stiff on the keyboard. I'd joke to myself that suffering builds character. But at night, I cried quietly into my pillow, wondering why I couldn't just be normal like everyone else. Or the time I asked Dad if I could borrow a little money, just enough to get me through a dry patch. He sighed so heavily, it was like I'd asked him for a kidney. You chose this path, he said. Sometimes learning the hard way is the only way. He transferred me $100 and made sure to remind me how irresponsible I was for needing it. I paid him back a month later. He never acknowledged it. Or the time my uncle cornered me at a Christmas party. I was standing near the snack table, trying to avoid conversation, when he leaned in and said loud enough for others to hear. You still doing that freelance thing? Must be nice to sit around in pajamas all day. I should get into that. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because what else could I do? Inside, I wanted to disappear. And then there was Mom. She never mocked me outright, but she had this way of framing everything as concern. Honey, you know we just want what's best for you. You're so talented, but talent isn't enough. Maybe you should consider a backup plan. Something stable. Every time she said it, I felt a piece of me shrink. I poured all of this into the slides. Slide 1. A photo of me at my desk in my first apartment, taken on a timer because I'd been trying to document my entrepreneurial journey. The caption, Year 1. You chose this path. Slide 2. A collage of my worst gigs, bad logos, hideous color palettes, desperate Fiverr reviews. Caption, Design is a nice hobby, but not a career. Slide 3. A calendar screenshot showing weeks with zero income, side by side with my uncle's Facebook post bragging about his new business venture. Slide 4. A graph of my earnings over time. A flat, depressing line for the first 2 years, with slow, tiny bumps. Caption, You can always go back to your old job. Slide 5. The turning point, the startup project. My proudest work, clean and polished. The caption, What you didn't see at 3 a.m. As I worked, I felt both drained and energized. Reliving those years hurt, but it also gave me perspective. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was grounded. I could see clearly how far I'd come. And that's when another realization hit me. I wasn't making this masterclass for them alone. I was making it for myself. Because for years, I'd carried this gnawing sense that maybe they were right. Maybe I was irresponsible, naive, unrealistic. Maybe I'd just gotten lucky. That little voice still whispered to me sometimes, even as I sat in my own house, with international clients and financial security. But seeing it laid out, the years of work, the steady climb, the sacrifices, shut that voice up. I hadn't gotten lucky. I'd worked my ass off, alone. When the slides were about halfway done, the family drama gave me new material. One Sunday, Mom called again. Casual small talk at first, then she slipped in. You know, your cousin's wedding is coming up. It would mean a lot if you helped with the expenses. Just a small contribution. You're doing so well, after all. I asked, why me? She paused. Well, you can afford it. And family takes care of family. I wanted to scream. Where had that philosophy been when I was skipping meals? When I was begging for a loan to cover rent? Instead, I said, I'll think about it, and hung up. Then I opened my laptop and added a new slide. Slide 6. A photo of a wedding invitation. Caption, Family comes first, when you can pay. Petty? Maybe. But it felt like oxygen in my lungs. My uncle gave me another one soon after. He called out of the blue, his voice unusually warm. Hey champ, I was thinking, you know that house of yours? Big place for one guy? Ever thought about renting a room out? My son could use a place while he looks for work. I was stunned. He wasn't asking, he was assuming. Like I should be grateful to have his son freeload in my home. I said, no, I like my privacy. He chuckled. Come on, don't be selfish. Family should help each other out. Another slide practically wrote itself. Slide 7. A stock photo of an open door. Caption, When I needed help, the door was closed. The more I worked, the more focused I became. Every slight, every dismissal, every false show of support, captured in black and white, laid bare. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg them to admit they were wrong. I was going to let the truth speak for itself. And when I finally stood in front of them, showing each slide, watching their faces as the weight of years pressed down, I knew it would be the sweetest revenge I could ever have. When the deck was about 90% finished, I started thinking about logistics. Up until then, the whole masterclass idea lived in my head as a sort of cathartic daydream. But now it was real, tangible. And if I wanted the impact I imagined, I had to actually stage it. So I made it official. I drafted an invitation, clean, professional, designed in the same style I'd use for a client event. The subject line read, An evening with my name, a masterclass in the creative journey. Inside it said, I'd like to invite you to a special presentation where I'll be sharing my journey as a designer, the challenges, the lessons, and the milestones. This is not just about work. It's about family, perseverance, and the truth behind success. I kept it neutral, even warm. I knew if I came across as hostile, they'd get defensive before it even started. I booked a small community space near my house, modern, minimalist, with a projector and comfortable chairs. I could have hosted it at home, but I didn't want them in my personal sanctuary. My house was mine, untouched. This was a performance, and it needed a stage. When I sent the invitations out, the reactions were immediate. Mom called within the hour. Honey, this is wonderful. Finally, you're sharing your story. I've always said people could learn from your determination. I bit back a smile. Always said, sure. Dad's response came by text. Proud of you, son. Looking forward to it. Short, almost formal. Typical dad. My uncle's reply was the most telling. He called, voice booming with fake enthusiasm. A masterclass, huh? That's great. I knew you'd get to a point where you could inspire others. Always told you freelancing could work if you just stuck with it. I let him ramble, noting silently how his memory kept rewriting itself. Even my cousins texted me things like, cool, man. Can we bring friends? I said no. This wasn't for outsiders. This was a closed performance, family only. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere shifted. Suddenly, I was the star attraction. Mom told me she'd invited some extended relatives because they'd love to see how far you've come. Dad mentioned he was telling the guys at work about my event. My uncle bragged online, going to a private talk by my nephew, the international designer. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I was invisible. Now, I was their trophy, their proof, their bragging rights. But inside, I stayed calm, focused. The more they built it up, the more satisfying it would be when the truth unfolded. In the days leading up to it, I polished the slides until they gleamed. I rehearsed, not just the words, but the pauses, the pacing, the tone. I wanted control. No anger, no bitterness spilling over. Just calm authority. I added a few final slides, too. Slide 8. A photo of me standing in front of my house, arms crossed, face serious. Caption: everything you see here was built without you. Slide 9. A single sentence on a black background. Support isn't real when it arrives only after success. And the closing slide. This is not a thank you. This is goodbye. I wasn't sure if I'd actually end with that last one. It felt like a nuclear button, but I kept it in my back pocket. The night before the event, I barely slept. I kept imagining their faces. Would Mom cry? Would Dad look ashamed? Would my uncle get defensive, crack a joke to deflect? I ran through every possible reaction, every possible outcome. And then, finally, the evening arrived. I got there early, set up the projector, arranged the chairs. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee from the machine in the corner. I tested the clicker for the slides 3 times, just to be sure. At 6:45, the first guests arrived, my parents. Mom hugged me tightly, beaming. Dad shook my hand like I was a colleague instead of his son. This is very professional, he said, looking around the room. I smiled politely. Thanks. By 7 o'clock, the rest of the family had filed in. Uncles, aunts, cousins. My uncle strutted in last, as if he were being announced at a gala. He clapped me on the back. Full house. You've made it, kid. I looked at him, steady. I've made it, yes. They settled into their seats, chatting, laughing, sipping the water bottles I'd laid out. The mood was casual, expectant. They thought this would be a feel-good talk, a celebration of success. They had no idea. At exactly 7:10, I dimmed the lights and walked to the front. The projector glowed behind me, the first slide ready. I looked at them, my parents, my uncle, the cousins who had once laughed at me in the corner. And for the first time in years, I felt completely steady. Thank you for coming, I began. Tonight, I want to share my story. Not the version you've heard, not the polished version people tell after the fact, but the real one. The one that's harder to hear. The room quieted. My uncle chuckled lightly, as if to break the tension, but no one joined him. I clicked to the first slide. A grainy photo of me at 23, hunched over a tiny desk in my cramped apartment. Year 1, I said. This was my office. This was my life. Silence. All eyes were on me. The performance had begun. The clicker in my hand felt heavier than it should have, like it carried all the years I was about to lay bare. I took a breath, looked around the room, at my mom's expectant smile, my dad's folded arms, my uncle leaning back like he owned the place, and I clicked. The grainy photo of my first apartment filled the wall. This was me at 23, I said evenly. I just quit my job at the agency. Everyone thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. I paused. No one moved. I saw my mom tilt her head slightly, as though bracing for something sentimental. What you don't see in this picture, I continued, is that I just finished a $20 gig for a client in another time zone. I hadn't slept in almost 2 days because if I didn't get that revision right, they weren't going to pay me. Click. The next slide appeared, a calendar screenshot with blank weeks highlighted in red. These were the weeks I made 0 income. Not low, Not barely scraping by. 0. Weeks where I counted coins to buy bread. Weeks where I couldn't afford the heating, so I worked in gloves and wrapped in a blanket. Weeks where I wondered if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I let the silence stretch. My dad's jaw shifted. Mom's smile had already wilted. Click. A collage of awful logos. Colors that clashed. Fonts that looked like they were picked at random. These, I said flatly, are the designs that bought my groceries. That kept the lights on. I sold them for the price of a takeout meal. Not because they were worth so little, but because that's all I could get people to pay me. And while I was doing this, click. A screenshot of my uncle's Facebook post from that same year. Launching my new venture. Big things ahead. Hashtag grind, hashtag success. I was listening to my family tell me freelancing was a hobby, that I was unemployed, that I should beg for my old job back. My uncle chuckled, shaking his head like I was exaggerating. It was just jokes, kid. We were teasing. I cut him off with the next slide, a quote in bold, white letters on black. Freelancing is code for unemployed. Underneath, Uncle, Christmas 2017. The room went dead still. My uncle's smile froze. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't gloat. I just looked at him. Then I turned back to the screen and clicked again. Now came the graph. Years of struggle represented in a thin, flat line crawling across the screen. For 2 years, this was my income, I said. 2 years of humiliation, of explaining to people what I did and watching their eyes glaze over. 2 years of holidays where I sat at this very table. I gestured toward them, listening to people laugh at me. The line began to rise. Slowly at first, then steeper. And this, I said quietly, is when I stopped listening. Slide after slide, I showed them the shift, the European startup that found me, the international contracts, the late nights that finally paid off. I showed them screenshots of glowing client emails, campaign launches, projects that made headlines overseas. But each success slide was paired with their words. You can always go back to your old job. Talent isn't enough. You're irresponsible. The captions cut like glass. I watched their faces as carefully as I'd watched client reactions during pitches. Mom's hands had folded in her lap, tight. Dad stared straight ahead, stone-faced, his lips pressed thin. My uncle squirmed, then tried to laugh it off again, only to fall silent when no one else joined. I clicked to the slide with the wedding invitation. This one, I said, is from just last year. After I'd bought my home. After my income had stabilized. Suddenly, I was being asked to contribute. Because family comes first. Funny how family didn't come first when I was begging for help to make rent. Mom's eyes flicked up at me, wet. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Click. The stock photo of the open door. My uncle asked if his son could move into my house. He said I was being selfish for saying no. I want to make this clear. When I needed a door to open, none opened. I learned to build my own. The air in the room was heavy now, like everyone was breathing shallowly. No one spoke. Even the cousins, usually glued to their phones, were sitting upright, watching me. Click. The photo of me standing in front of my house, arms crossed. Everything you see here, I said evenly, was built without you, without your support, without your encouragement, without your belief. Every dollar, every client, every brick of this house, I earned it in the silence you left me. I let that hang in the air. Then I clicked to the black slide. Support isn't real when it arrives only after success. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to look directly at Mom. Her face crumpled. She looked down at her lap. Dad shifted in his chair, like he wanted to say something but couldn't form the words. My uncle stared at the screen, jaw tight, the smirk long gone. I had one more slide left. The nuclear one. I clicked. White letters on black. This is not a thank you. This is goodbye. The silence was deafening. I took a slow breath. That's my story. That's what I wanted you to know. You can tell people whatever version you want outside these walls, but now you've seen the truth. Thank you for coming. And then I stood there. Still. Calm. No apology. No softening. They didn't clap. It wasn't that kind of presentation. For a long moment, no one moved. Then my uncle barked a laugh, forced and brittle. Come on, kid. That's a bit dramatic, isn't it? We were just joking, I asked. My voice was even, almost gentle. You were joking while I wondered if I could afford food. You were joking while I froze in my apartment. You were joking while I begged Dad for $100. That wasn't a joke to me. That was my life. He shut his mouth. Mom whispered, We didn't know. You didn't want to know? I said. No one argued. I walked over to my laptop, shut it, and the room lit back up. For the first time that evening, I smiled. Not wide, not gloating, but calm. This concludes the masterclass, I said. I'll let you all get home. And with that, I started stacking chairs, like any other event winding down. One by one, they filed out. Some avoided my eyes. Mom touched my arm briefly before leaving, but said nothing. My uncle muttered something about kids these days, but his voice lacked conviction. When the last door closed, I stood alone in the empty room. And for the first time in years, I felt completely free. The morning after the masterclass, I woke up with that strange, buzzing clarity you get after a big decision. The kind where your body is exhausted, but your mind is wide awake. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and just breathed. No dread, no second-guessing, no little voice saying, maybe you went too far. Because I hadn't. I'd gone exactly far enough. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew my family wouldn't just sit with what I'd shown them. They'd talk. They'd text. They'd spin. Sure enough, by noon the messages started. Mom sent the first one. We're proud of you. We really are. We just didn't realize how much you went through. Can we talk sometime soon? I stared at it, coffee in hand. The wording struck me. We didn't realize. No apology. No accountability. Just a neat way of making ignorance sound innocent. Dad's message followed. Your presentation was powerful. Maybe too harsh in parts, but I get where you're coming from. We'll reflect on it. Reflect. Like it was a sermon. Like I'd preached at them, not lived it. And my uncle, of course, had to call instead of text. I let it ring out. He left a voicemail dripping with indignation. Kid, you embarrassed the family last night. Airing dirty laundry like that? You think that's classy? I was just joking all those years, and you took it personal. You'll see someday. When you have kids, family comes first. I didn't save the voicemail. The cousins chimed in on our group chat later. One sent, Yo, that was intense. Another added a meme about PowerPoint presentations, as if to defuse the tension. No one outright defended me, but no one attacked me either. They just didn't know what to do with it. And that was fine. Because here's the thing. For the first time in my life, I didn't need them to do anything. I didn't need validation, or apologies, or even acknowledgement. I had said what I needed to say. They had heard it. Whether they accepted it or not was no longer my problem. That realization was like unclenching a fist I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the silence. Normally, there'd be at least one favor call from Mom. Help with a bill, help with a cousin, help with something. Normally, Dad would drop hints about investing in Uncle's projects. Normally, Uncle himself would pepper me with messages about logos or websites or his son needing a place to crash. Nothing. At first, I half expected an explosion, a confrontation, some dramatic family fallout. But it didn't come. Instead, it was like a quiet freeze. Communication dropped to bare minimums. Mom sent a polite text on my birthday. Dad forwarded me an article about design once. My uncle? Radio silence. It was blissful. Without the constant background noise of their demands, my life opened up in ways I hadn't realized were possible. I threw myself into work with a clearer head. I took on a client in Japan that had been circling me for months. I finally had the bandwidth to start a personal project, a typeface I'd been sketching on scraps of paper for years. More than that, I started living. I joined a local photography club, something I'd been too drained to do before. I met people who didn't know me as the family disappointment or the late-blooming success. They just knew me as me. It was strange, liberating, and a little sad all at once. Because the truth is, part of me had always hoped, deep down, that one day my family would say the words I wanted to hear. We were wrong. We didn't believe in you, and we should have. We're sorry. But they didn't. And I realized they never would. People rarely rewrite themselves that much. It was easier for them to live in their version of history than face the real one. So I let go of the hope. Not in anger, not in bitterness. Just release. Like dropping a heavy bag I'd carried too far. I didn't cut them off with an announcement. No dramatic, I'm done with you. I just stopped feeding the cycle. When Mom sent a polite message, I replied politely, nothing more. When Dad asked about work, I kept it vague. When my uncle eventually broke his silence and sent a text, Hey, you free to help with a small design thing? I replied with 3 words, my rate applies. He never responded. And that was that. Meanwhile, my own world kept expanding. My typeface project gained traction online. A few design blogs picked it up, and suddenly I had other designers reaching out, asking if I'd sell licenses. My Japanese client extended our contract. Money wasn't just stable, it was abundant. For the first time, I felt the luxury of saying no to work. But more than money, it was peace. I'd come home at night, unlock my door, and know that the space inside was mine. No one could diminish it. No one could take credit for it. No one could demand a piece of it. Sometimes I'd think back to that presentation, the look on their faces, the silence after the final slide. And instead of bitterness, I felt a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't begged for recognition. I hadn't tried to change their minds. I had just told the truth. And the truth had done the work for me. In its aftermath, I wasn't weighed down anymore. I was free. Closure doesn't come with fireworks. That's something I learned after the dust settled. There was no big confrontation, no last blow-up, no dramatic, and then they finally admitted they were wrong. Just silence, distance, and the gradual realization that I didn't need anything else from them. Life went on. Mine anyway. A few months after the masterclass, Mom tried again to bridge the gap. She invited me to Sunday dinner. Her text said, "It would be nice to have you back with everyone. No pressure." I stared at the message for a while. For years, those dinners had been minefields. Every bite of food accompanied by little barbs. Every laugh at my expense disguised as family warmth. I could still feel the weight of sitting at that table, swallowing my words. So I wrote back, "Thanks, but I'm good. I like the space I have now." She didn't reply, and I think, in her own way, she understood. Dad reached out less and less. He sent the occasional news article about design trends, which I found mildly amusing, as if that would connect us. I responded politely, briefly, never opening doors for longer conversations. He seemed to accept it. My uncle? He faded out completely. No more calls, no more jokes, no more requests for favors. I heard through the grapevine that his latest venture had failed, another in a long line of failures. Once upon a time, he'd have tried to drag me in, to squeeze money or work out of me. But after the masterclass, I think even he knew the door was closed. And it was locked. What surprised me most was how easy it was. For so long, I thought cutting that cord would feel violent, like sawing off a limb. But once it was done, once the silence stretched and I stopped filling it, it felt natural. Like this was the way it should have been all along. In the absence of their noise, I found my own rhythm. I worked when I wanted, traveled when I felt like it. I took a solo trip to Iceland, something I dreamed about back in those freezing nights at my old desk. Standing under the northern lights, camera in hand, I thought about that kid wrapped in blankets, staring at a glowing screen, desperate for a chance. I wanted to tell him, it'll be worth it. Every lonely night, every cruel word. It'll all be worth it. Back home, I invested in myself, upgraded my equipment, built a small studio in the extra room of my house. I started mentoring younger designers online, not as some grand gesture, but because I knew how it felt to be laughed at for chasing something different. I told them the truth, the parts most people like to gloss over. The hunger, the doubt, the small humiliations. They always thank me for being honest. And in those moments, I realized I'd built the support I never had. Not from family, but from strangers who became peers, colleagues, sometimes friends. People who respected the work because they knew the grind. That's the thing I've learned. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't your home. Sometimes you have to build your own. Do I miss them? In small ways, maybe. I miss the idea of family. The version where parents beam with pride, uncles cheer you on, dinners are filled with warmth instead of sharp edges. But that version never existed for me. Holding on to the fantasy only hurt. Letting it go healed. Every now and then, I still hear updates. A cousin's baby, an aunt's surgery, the endless carousel of my uncle's ventures. I nod politely, wish them well, and move on. They're characters in my story, but they no longer dictate it. And that, to me, is the truest revenge. Not the slides. Not the stunned silence in that room. Not even the quiet retreat that followed. It's waking up in my own home, opening my laptop to clients who value me, surrounding myself with people who see me for who I am, not who they wished I'd been. It's sitting at peace with my own choices, no longer haunted by their voices. It's knowing that I don't need to prove anything anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. The night of the masterclass, when I stood alone in that empty room, I thought the satisfaction came from showing them the truth. But really, it came from realizing I'd finally stopped needing them to see it. That's where the quiet triumph lives, in the freedom. So if there's anyone reading this who's in that in-between place, mocked, dismissed, doubting if it's even worth it, this is the part one wish someone had told me. True revenge isn't making them eat their words. It's living in such a way that their words no longer matter. And once you get there, you won't even feel like you're carrying revenge anymore. Just peace. That's where I am now. 28. A house of my own. A career that's mine, built from the ground up. A life free from the weight of their disbelief. And a silence that finally feels like home.